Great. So I'm just wondering, and Craig, maybe we can start with you. What do you see as the main drivers of Ontario's economy for the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, just to pick up on a few themes that you heard earlier from Craig Wright, the Ontario economy is actually expected to deliver a relatively solid pace of economic growth. And this might actually be a little surprising because when you pick up the newspapers and you listen to the press, you get a real glass half full perspective on the outlook. And I got to say that when I was listening to the responses to various questions and the slides we had earlier, I think it's important to understand that the construction industry in Canada, and particularly in Ontario, has risen as a share of the economy over time. So when we talk about is it going to grow, is it going to shrink, keep in mind that it's operating at a very high level of activity as a starting point. So it's actually a very robust industry. But in terms of where do we see growth coming from? Well, if you think about consumers, they're heavily indebted, and they're not going to be willing to leverage up their balance sheets a lot more than they already have. And so really consumer spending is going to be a contributor to economic growth, but it's really not going to be booming. So then you say, well, where else are you going to see growth? And then when you look at the Ontario economy, Ontario is very much an export-oriented economy. It produces a lot of non-resource manufactured products. And if you actually look at the history of Canada, we're actually oriented along north-south lines, not east-west. We do far more trade with the United States than the provinces do across the provinces, right? So, the way I typically think about Canada is we're basically California with really bad weather. Right? Because the population's about the size of California, the size of the economy is about the size of California, but spread across the entire width of the United States. And what that means is that we're really plugged into a North American economic production chain. And so Ontario is very plugged into the US or North America production supply chains, and that's going to drive a lot of economic growth that then is going to have spin-off effects. But when you think about Ontario itself, you can also think about it like clusters. So what's going to happen in Windsor? Well, we're going to see a lot of additional auto production. We're going to see auto parts production. So you're going to see that coming back. The level of activity in the auto sector is doing quite well. It's a bit disappointing that we haven't attracted more investment in the auto sector. But on the parts, on the parts side, we've actually seen some good growth. Then you say, okay, well, what about the GTA? Well, it's going to be financial services. It's going to be professional services. GTA is very diversified. We've got manufacturers. You think about Ottawa. Well, Ottawa is a government town, but also a tech sector. So the tech sector in Ottawa is expected to actually do well, and the federal government's shifting towards stimulus. So where are you going to see the growth there? Well, you're going to see the government shifting from reducing their spending to increasing their spending. That's going to be good for the local economy. Kitchener-Waterloo, again, an IT hub, likely to do very, very well. You think about London. London is one of the most diversified cities we actually have in Ontario. It has a bit of everything. And so it really shouldn't be surprising that the survey results you were getting actually were favorable for London, because it's also on the 400 route into the United States. And so, if non-commodity exports are going to do well, London's going to do well, but it's also got, health services, education. So I think that really what you're looking at in Ontario, economists are typically glass half empty people, but after watching and hearing what I did for the last sort of hour or so, I think people need to reset your expectations, because the outlook is actually not negative. The outlook is actually positive.
All right, well, thanks for that, Craig. How about you, Livio? Are you as optimistic? I know our Ontario economy has been defined that we're going through structural changes. So are those structural changes going to have a positive or negative impact on our economy going forward? Do you think that the survey and the information we saw here this morning was not really an accurate depiction? Do you think it's going to be more optimistic like Craig thinks?
Well, I think how Ontario is going to do, and your perceptions of how Ontario is going to do, pretty much depends on where you are in Ontario to a certain extent. I mean, certain parts of the province have been hit with more transition than others. If you look at the Ontario economy, it's really two economies at this point. You have the GTA, and you have everybody else. The GTA basically accounts for half of Ontario's economy. It accounts for half of Ontario's employment. Employment in the GTA has grown at about twice the rate of employment outside the GTA. So the GTA is doing very well. And best placed after the GTA is what you would call, I suppose, the GTA belt. It extends west probably to as far west as maybe Kitchener-Waterloo, the Guelph area, north to Barrie, probably east to Belleville, curves a bit around the lake to a bit past Hamilton. That area there is in enough proximity to the GTA to take advantage of the opportunities there directly. So as you add more infrastructure, light rail, transit, and improve that, that area also gets better plugged in. Then there's the area outside. You have a sort of, I guess what Craig would call a cluster in Ottawa that's rooted in the federal government and provides sort of a focus of growth for Eastern Ontario. You have the Southwest, which traditionally had a strong agricultural and manufacturing focus. And then you had the North, which had a more of a resource base. So, I mean, if you're in the GTA economy is very robust. It's doing quite well. I mean, there's construction cranes everywhere. The construction activity outside the GTA seems to be a bit more public sector dependent. So is Ontario doing well? Ontario is doing better than it was. But Ontario at present also looks better because everybody else is doing so poorly. If you look at the economy from about 2010 to 2014, Canada grew fairly robustly, but a lot of it was rooted on the energy resource sector in 3 provinces. So what's happened now is that sector has, in a sense, fallen with the drop in energy and commodity prices. Although Ontario is doing better, Ontario, Central Canada, and Atlantic Canada still have not picked up the slack from a national perspective. So we're doing better. We could do better yet in order to bring up the national economy.
All right, and now, Livio, you're from Thunder Bay. I think you might be the only person in the audience from Thunder Bay. Is there anyone else from Thunder Bay? Oh, look, we got a couple from Thunder Bay. That's great. So just maybe a brief comment. In our contractor survey, the North was the most pessimistic in terms of future work outlook. So what's your experience kind of on the ground there in the North and commodity prices, and what do you see happening in the near to medium term for construction activity in the North?
Right. Well, the North has had, over the last decade, you open up the 21st century with the forest sector crisis. And so the forest sector crisis probably eliminated 10 to 20% of employment. Even the unemployment rates now are attractive or look good in the North, mainly because the labor force has shrunk faster than the level of employment. So it opens up with that. A lot of discussion then of the resource frontier and the Ring of Fire, but we haven't fully capitalized on that either. And it's taken a fairly long time to get steps taken to build the necessary infrastructure, so that by the time the decision is made, of course, the commodity boom is over, and so the sector really has not developed to the extent that people thought. If you looked at the northwest portion of the province, there was expectations that by 2018, on top of the 5 operating mines that you had there would be an additional 9 in operation. None of those have come to fruition. They've been tied up in negotiations with First Nations or environmental assessments. There's been the cost of electricity, which has been a factor. There's, of course, the absence of infrastructure. And, of course, then once the commodity prices come down, they're not profitable. I mean, the fundamental factor is the fall in commodity prices. Once those are restored, you'll probably see the process pick up again. But the pessimism is generally based on the fact that much of the private sector industrial development has disappeared is maybe too strong a word, but a lot of pulp mills have closed, sawmills, the resource frontier hasn't picked up. And the resource frontier is important. I mean, Ontario's history, if you think about it, the early 20th century, Ontario's north was its resource frontier. There are a lot of investment money went up, opening up the north. And that region does have the potential to serve as a resource frontier again. I mean, resources make up 6% of Ontario's economy. Even much of Ontario's transportation network, large chunks of it are to transport resources. So even those that feel that the era of rocks and trees are over, well, they said that in the late 90s too. If you recall that far back, in the late 90s with the information highway and high tech, everyone said the era of rocks and trees is over. Next thing you know, there's a resource commodity boom, and that propels the Canadian economy for 10 to 15 years. So resources will always be important, and they will be also important to Ontario. And the resource sector is also important in terms of knowledge infrastructure. If you think of mining, mining isn't just digging things up of the ground. Mining is very high tech. There's a lot of engineering involved. There's a lot of computer software involved. It's also a knowledge-intensive industry. The resource sector in general, then, can build upon that. But I'm going on too long. I'm starting to monopolize the discussion.
You are a professor, right? We
That's right.
Well, academics.
Academics.
There is an exam at the end.
Yeah. So let's ask your views on this, Mark, from public-private partnerships, and how does that fit into a more robust marketplace for those types of approaches to construction projects related to the economy? Do you see a relationship there, and what's your experience based on Ontario's economic future and the need or requirement or interest in more 3Ps?
Well, I think what's particularly interesting at the moment is the growing interest in infrastructure and trying to address the huge gaps that exist. And not only in Ontario, you see this right across the country. There really aren't any accurate figures at the moment, but the latest studies I've seen peg the infrastructure deficit in Canada at somewhere between $300 and $400 billion. So it's significant. And we'll see what comes out of the budget on the 22nd of March. There's no doubt that the government will address the infrastructure issue. We'll see how they'll address it. That'll make a difference, of course. You saw the most recent budget from Ontario. Again, very strong focus on investing in infrastructure. In fact, additional monies identified beyond what the government had announced a bit earlier. So that's all very encouraging. What's really important is that there is this huge need across the province with respect to infrastructure. Politicians all recognize it. They're all faced with the same kind of fiscal responsibilities. So you've really got to be innovative in your thinking in terms of how you address that. And that's where things like public-private partnerships come to the fore. But most importantly, irrespective of the challenge, everyone knows that investing in infrastructure creates jobs, it stimulates economic development, and it really makes a difference for really vaulting Ontario onto the global stage in a much more competitive way. So to get down to the basics, I think what you're going to see happening is the government, in fact, investing in infrastructure development, and that, quite frankly, has an immediate and very beneficial impact for everybody in this room, in my view. And so public-private partnerships have really taken hold in Ontario. Probably this is the province that has the strongest commitment to that approach to business. And here, as you probably know, it's called Alternative Financing and Procurement, AFPs. But the intent here is to get government partnering with private sector to take on responsibility for designing new infrastructure, getting it built, arranging for some of the private financing to enable it to really get traction, and then maintaining the asset over the next 25, 30, 35 years. That's really key, because as you know, when governments had moved ahead with infrastructure development in the more traditional way, maintenance has sort of been of interest, but generally doesn't get done. And furthermore, as governments run into fiscal problems, they tend to move their funds away from maintenance. It ain't that sexy. And in the end, you get a gardener that's some days strong, some days weak. The Champlain Bridge in Montreal certainly falling down, being replaced now. So I think governments are recognizing the need to make those kinds of investments. And the private sector is very keen to engage. And I think it's great because if you look at how these projects are structured, they're fixed price contracts. And the best part of it is that the private sector takes on responsibility for the cost of design and construction. And if in fact they don't meet their own targets, they've got to absorb that cost. So no one really knows what contractors are actually paying in order to meet their commitments to government, but there's huge discipline introduced in these projects to ensure that government is held exempt. So now I don't want to talk as long as these guys are talking, because then you'll think I'm an economist too.
You're doing a pretty good job. You're doing a pretty good job, Mark.
So let me put it in the simplest terms, because this is the way I understand it. We're talking here simply about a mortgage. So if you went ahead and bought a home for $1 million, which is the minimum you're going to be paying in this city these days, but you go home and buy a home and you mortgage it for 30 years, and you know what your payments are month by month, and then if your roof leaks, as mine did a week after I bought the house, then if it was the responsibility of the builder of the house to fix that leak and at their expense, that'd be a hell of a way to move ahead. And that's the essence of a public-private partnership, and that's why it's taking more and more hold across the country.
Right. Well, and I think you'd find in this room that most of the folks are in support and in agreement with AFP projects and P3 projects, however you want to describe them. There certainly are some issues at the fringes in terms of, you know, how does that work get distributed across various size of contractors, you know, the issues around bundling and so on. But I think generally the people in this room would think alternative financing projects are a good way to make investments in infrastructure for a variety of different reasons that you pointed out. I wanted to switch and maybe go to something else that we hear a lot about in the media with respect to Ontario's economy, and that's productivity. You know, so I'm a layperson, you know, I have a minor in economics, but you hear this productivity notion being raised all the time, and it's kind of like, I don't know what the rest of you people think, but it's kind of like blah, 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 you know, like productivity. And so we ask a question here for the audience. It's on your app. And I'll ask Craig to weigh in on this, and then we'll see what the audience thinks. And that's that last week StatsCan released a report indicating Canada's labor productivity rate contracted, so we're getting less productive by 0.2% in 2015, further pushing us to the back of the pack when compared to G7 nations. Now, are most of you people like me, well, does that really matter? How does that impact me? So, you know, how important is productivity to the future economic growth of Ontario and Canada? Craig, what do you think?
Well, it's absolutely critical. If you actually think about, so productivity, just the notion of it, even the word, carries negative connotations to most Canadians. Right? Most Canadians actually think productivity means working harder or producing more with fewer workers. You know, so there's sort of a negative sentiment towards productivity.
Kind of working more for less.
Yeah, working more for less would be, you know, so whenever I talk about productivity, I actually don't use the word productivity. I use competitiveness, and I use innovation, and I use words that have a more positive connotation. Because ultimately, if you actually look at the performance of the Canadian economy and you say, what drove the rise of standard of living of Canadians since the end of the Second World War, 80% of the increase in the standard of living we've experienced since 1945 has actually come from the economy getting more competitive, more innovative, doing new things differently, and actually making every worker have a bigger impact in the economy. And so productivity is absolutely critical. And this is one of Canada's big challenges. And it gets slightly complex, but you know, the basic notion here is we're faced with two challenges, right? Economies grow either because they have more workers or they're actually using their labor force more productively, getting more impact per worker. Well, what do we have in Canada? Well, we have an aging population. The baby boomers are starting to enter retirement. And we can try to use immigration to offset or diminish the impact, but understand that the number of baby boomers is just so large, the number of immigrants you'd have to bring in to keep the labor force growing at the same pace. Instead of bringing in 250,000 a year, we'd have to bring in more than 2 million a year. And there's just no way we would actually be able to integrate all those newcomers effectively in the economy. So labor force growth is going to slow. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, you know, I get worried when contractors are saying they're having shortages of skilled workers, because we know that a lot of the demographic pressure is coming from older baby boomers leaving. They have skills that are important in the economy, and skills and trades identified as one of those areas where we're going to lose a lot of workers. So, you know, good news if you're in the industry, you know, starting out, because it means there's going to be lots of demand for people with these skill sets. But for the economy as a whole, the labor force is going to slow. So if the labor force is going to slow, what's going to drive growth? The answer is productivity. But productivity growth has been steadily declining. You know, in the 1960s, it was growing at about 5%. In the 1970s, it was about 4%. In the 1990s, it was 2%. And now we're getting really lucky if we get like 1% growth. And Craig Wright made a very simple comment that I'm sure didn't actually resonate that much, but it's related to this. He said that the benchmark for good economic growth is now something around 1.5%. Most Canadians actually think, when you get to 3% or 4%, that's good. And it turns out actually 1.5 is now the definition of good because of these factors. So if Ontario is going to flourish, we can't really fix the demographics, although we can do a good job of attracting immigrants, but it's still not going to offset the aging. We're only going to succeed if Canadian businesses are more productive, more innovative, more capable of competing in the world market. And you know what? The question would be like, why are we so bad at productivity? And I can do 2 hours on that, and you don't want that. And the thing about it is, it's a little like it's like the murder on the Orient Express. It's like a murder mystery. We got a lot of good suspects, and like the murder on the Orient Express, it turns out they all did it. Right? We don't do enough R&D. We invest less on machine equipment per worker. We're very slow about adopting new technologies. Canadian businesses generally want to road test technology in the United States. They want to see US businesses run with it for about 5 years before they'll invest in it. But the speed at which technology moves is that by that point it's obsolete. Right? So, and from a business point of view, there's a culture issue. Canadian business leaders are more risk averse than their international counterparts. So there's an awful lot of issues related to here, but we really need to fix this, because this ultimately will determine how successful we are at continuing to raise the standard of living that Canadians are used to.
So you would definitely be in the camp in terms of the responses to this question that productivity growth is extremely important.
And infrastructure would play a part of that, right? Like, so the economy, bottlenecks in our economy, aging infrastructure that isn't meeting the needs of businesses, it's costing the Ontario economy billions of dollars.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons why at the federal and the provincial level, there's been this recognition of how important infrastructure is. Partly because what they know is actually, if you do the math, infrastructure investment has the biggest short-term boost. So when you do it, you get a bigger kick to your economy's economic growth rate than, say, tax cuts. So infrastructure is good for getting the money out the door in terms of getting a boost to the economy immediately, but it also has this long-term payoff from raising productivity. But infrastructure isn't going to be enough. Like there's a lot more of other issues at work here that we need to figure out.
Let's see what the audience thinks about productivity.
Well, that's not fair. That just means
important.
I made a good
Look
argument.
At that. Yeah, we're just seeing, how convincing you are, I guess, Craig. So extremely important. So, despite my references earlier about people being blah, blah, blah about productivity, maybe that's just me, I guess. People in the audience certainly do believe it to be very important. Livio, what do you think? Greg shared his views of productivity, and it's obviously most people would agree that it's important. Could you maybe nail one or two things that you think could be done to improve productivity?
Well, before I do that, actually, I just want to stress productivity from another dimension. And really, in the end, productivity is directly linked to your income and pay. So think about this. If your productivity is growing 2% a year, you can expect your output to double in 35 years. Okay? In the 60s, when productivity was growing at 5 or 6% a year, you could expect your output, and hence your incomes, to double maybe in about 10 years. That's the implication if you don't get your productivity up. Your long-term standard of living is not going to rise as quickly. So what can you do to boost productivity? In Ontario's case, we're already doing a lot of the right things. We're investing in human capital, we're investing in infrastructure, we're building our transportation networks. I mean, all that is happening. It's easier to invest in infrastructure and in new capital equipment, of course, if your economy is growing robustly. If you think of manufacturing, for example, if the demand for our manufactured products was growing more rapidly, firms would have more confidence to invest in more equipment, more machinery, to take advantage of that. Once you have a period where there's been some shrinkage, you get more uncertain, you get more timid, and Canadians in general are not as entrepreneurial and are more timid, I suppose, than Americans. So one of the best things that could probably happen right now for Ontario, one thing would be if we continue on with these trade negotiations, first with the Europeans, then with the Trans-Pacific, that opens up the market. I mean, Canada is a small, open economy. We basically need to grow our markets as much as we can to boost the demand for our products, because that will fuel investment. So it's not enough just to trade with the US. We also have to trade outside of that. And trade is very important. 30% of our GDP is in trade for Canada. Think if you had no trade, that's a 30% pay cut. You have to think of it in those terms. So that's the first thing, basically growing the markets through trade. And then productive investment in capital, I think, is probably the best way to go, particularly in transportation infrastructure. I think there are a lot more bottlenecks in our economy from the transportation side than we care to admit. If you're looking nationally, road, rail, marine, I mean, 2/3 of the business there is transporting resource products, and most people don't realize that. Then anything else that has to be shipped also goes on that network. If you wanted the biggest bang for your buck in terms of boosting productivity nationally, you have to upgrade the highway system. The Americans would never stand for their entire country having just one 2-lane highway link between east and west that is subject to the whims of an errant moose in heat that could cause an accident and block the road for a week.
Yeah.
But in Canada,
that bridge went out at Thunder Bay, right? TransCanada was closed.
No, it wasn't a moose, but nonetheless, the bridge went out. And if you think about it, it's just appalling. Even when we built the transcontinental railways, we eventually made sure there were 3 routes. Okay, I mean, we've built the highway, and it all converges to one node. So essentially, if you're going to have 70% or 60% of your trade with the US, the border has thickened. You do need an east-west route that's more robust. And that type of infrastructure in itself would be quite useful in boosting the country's productivity, not just the province's productivity.
Just add one other dimension that's important is Canada isn't going to be able to compete if on the base of labor costs. Right? If we try to compete with places like China and India on the cost of labor, we will lose, right? So ultimately, we need to actually compete on the basis of skills, right? And the great thing is that we have a good education system. We have a very high skilled labor force today. But there's also opportunities to build on that skilled labor force. There's a lot of opportunities to actually improve things. For example, we know Aboriginals and First Nations people are not having acceptable outcomes. And part of it is related to educational outcomes. We know youths aren't having the desired experiences when they enter the labor market. We've got a bad mix on the skills coming out of university versus what employers actually need. I did a chart of employment rates by diploma, and then you look at enrollment rates by program, and they actually look like mirror images of one another, right? So there is scope that we can even do better in terms of boosting, and the reference was to human capital. It's a word economists use, but probably shouldn't be used publicly, like productivity, right? But what we're really talking about is investing in talent, and I think that ultimately Ontario competes on the basis of talent, not on the basis of cost.
Right. So it sounds like we have agreement with respect to infrastructure that it can provide multiple advantages to the economy. One is improved productivity. The other is stimulus in terms of more jobs for construction in the industry, and they buy more consumer goods. And so, Mark, the federal government now, when they're talking about infrastructure investment, we heard a lot about that this morning and the numbers and so on. But they've got this new terminology now, shovel ready, which was really what we focused on in 2008, 2009. They want to shift away now to shovel worthy. So how would you define, is there an equation to determine the government weighing different infrastructure projects and what's shovel ready and what's shovel worthy?
I think probably it's interesting terminology. And I think what it really means is shovel-ready stuff is stuff you can get done right now. So if you want to get a hockey rink built or new municipal facilities, you can move money out the door quickly and get those projects done. On the other hand, if you want to go ahead and build a subway system or an LRT, or like the Eglinton Crosstown project, which is taking place here, that's something that probably falls in the category of shovel-worthy, because what we're thinking about here is a little more long-term development, which has a different kind of sustainable economic impact. So that's probably the distinction between the two, and both are important. And I think what you'll see in the budget coming down in a couple of weeks is in fact a reference to both of those. So money will go out through existing infrastructure funding at the federal level, which is meant for communities to move ahead right now. And it might be maintenance of existing facilities, which are really important and we often forget about, or it might be some of those activities that would really enhance communities and community value. But government will be very focused because they've talked now about the largest investment ever, $125 billion over the next 10 years. That's very significant. And they have to begin planning now for how that is going to roll out. And I think that is the piece of it that is shovel-worthy in a sense of let's think about long-term economic development and make sure that what we're doing has a significant sustainable component to it.
Okay.
And that'll be, so the budget will be very interesting in that sense. And of course, you'll see a lot of focus on the areas that the government's already said are important to them. It's going to be investment in economic infrastructure, that's really transit. Then they'll be talking about social infrastructure, affordable housing, help for seniors, that kind of stuff. And then green infrastructure, and that's likely going to involve areas like water and wastewater, energy projects, green energy projects. So it'll be very interesting. And there's a lot of talk this morning about what the budget deficit might look like. What I will say is that we did commission Nick Nanos to do some survey work for us over the last couple of weeks, and what he found is that the majority of people that were surveyed, over 65%, were completely supportive of the government's decision to go further and further into deficit in order to enable infrastructure development to take place. Right. Very interesting. And there was support for the three areas that are focus of the government. And the support for public-private partnerships was up to 67%, which was a 5% jump over the previous year. So that's moving in the right direction. We found those results, in a sense, very encouraging. Right. Now let's see how the government delivers over the next couple of weeks. Okay.
Are there any questions from the audience? We're welcome questions from the mic here. And meanwhile, maybe if we can go to question 3 on the app about, do you think the federal and provincial government should expand the reach of public-private partnerships into more non-traditional sectors? If you could start your responses to that, and we'll get the panelists' comments. Don.
I'm wondering what how you gentlemen feel about the potential Toronto bid for Expo 2025.
Okay. Expo 2025. Don's on our board, and we had a presentation on that at our board meeting yesterday. So it'd be interesting to hear. There's a couple of things about Expo 2025 that we learned yesterday. One is that there's work that needs to happen at the Don River anyways, regardless if they get Expo 2025. But also this idea of expos compared to an Olympics. Expos really are a showcase for Canada's goods and services and what we produce. And if you do it right, you can strike bilateral trade agreements with other economies and so on. And I don't think a lot of people understand that about expos. So they're really pitching it as something that can really help our economy go to the next step. What do the panelists think? Do you think it's a good thing for Ontario to proceed with this?
Well, this is an interesting one, right? Because it has both a logical component, you've talked about it, and a bit of an emotional one. So I think on the emotional front, people are split on these kinds of things. You look at the Olympics, for instance, which took place in Sochi, Russia, $50 billion to enable that to go ahead, and most of those facilities are no longer being used, right? So people would say, geez, why would I waste my money on that? With $50 billion, I could probably cure most of the diseases in Africa. On the other hand, the value of moving ahead with an initiative like this is, from my perspective, quite strong on two fronts. First and foremost, infrastructure that has been waiting for years to be built actually gets done when events like this take place. So in the case of the Olympics, for instance, the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, they got the Canada Line built, which is the little transit system which takes you from the airport to downtown. It had been lagging for a long time, and they happened to use a public-private partnership for that. They saved $90 million and got it done. And they also repaired the highway, the Sea to Sky Highway up to Whistler. Terrific. In the case of the Pan Am Games here, we finally got a transit system to get us from downtown to the airport. We're probably the only major metropolis in the world that to date didn't have that. You can debate about the price of the Up Express. That part is not important.
It's better now, that price. Isn't
Yeah, but and that's fine. But the infrastructure itself, quite remarkable, built on time, on budget, in order to meet a deadline. So I think you're going to find that, quite apart from the things you highlighted, which I think are really important, I think you'll find that moving ahead with initiatives like this will enable us to, in fact, get a whole bunch of ancillary infrastructure that's also been necessary built in order to enable the main event to be successful.
Additional comments, Expo 2025?
I think you summarized it very well. I mean, the big issue is, it can be simulative. It can lead to additional investment. It's all about whether the investments actually have long-term payoffs, or whether those investments actually are only for that particular project or games, right? And that's the classic experience you've had time and time again around things like Olympics and others. But on the showcasing, Canada, I also think these things are quite useful for garnering international attention and recognition. And I do a lot of, I've done trade missions for Department of Foreign Affairs, reaching out to other countries, and when you go and you try and tell the Canadian story, you really have to try and sell Canada, because from an awareness point of view, we're only 3% of the world economy, so we don't get the same sort of attention that, say, the United States gets. And so things like the Expo or other things like that can actually raise your profile. It gives you some opportunities. But again, you just got to watch out for the cost overruns and things like that can really undermine the economic benefits.
Right. Well, it's a great idea. I'm concerned about, I guess, responsible fiscal planning and putting together the bid and then the implementation. The only other offhand comment I have, though, about the whole thing is I guess I'm not as familiar with the 2025 Expo bid. Being from Northern Ontario, I guess I'm a little tuned out on that. But I guess why 2025? I mean, if I was going to plan for an Expo, Canada turns 150 in 2017. It's too late, I know, to plan for it, but the planning should have been in advance to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Federation. 2025, what would be what's the driver? Just to have an expo and get infrastructure, or is there something behind the date? Is it an anniversary for Toronto, or?
It's the whole process. There's a World Exposition Board. You got to put in a bid.
Okay.
It's similar to the Olympics. So.
Just trying to help. I'm an economist. I'm one of the helping professions too.
Yeah. All right. Got another question from the floor?
Sure. Andy Manahan with Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Livio, I read something you wrote about in January, I think it was a couple of months ago, and providing advice to the federal government on infrastructure projects that would result in better ROI. Could you maybe elaborate for the audience what you said? And I guess secondly, has the federal government listened to your advice?
Well, I'm an academic, so I'm used to not being listened to, period. So, I mean, that's just the way it goes. In terms of what I read, I can't remember what you read. I can't remember what I wrote. However, if I was to offer the federal government some advice on infrastructure, I think it's very important that they prioritize. And I think one of the key concerns I would have with any infrastructure program is I would be leery about how the decisions are going to be made in terms of the degree of politics involved, et cetera. I think the first thing I would do is set up some type of arm's length independent board or commission to basically rank and prioritize the projects. You know, put on accountants, engineers, economists, a few business people to sort of, on a case-by-case basis, try and work out what the rate of return to the project is and to rank them as opposed to making the decision purely political. I think you'll get a much better outcome in the long term in terms of selecting the projects. And I mean, that would be the best advice I could offer. And I also think that you have to be as fiscally responsible as you can. I think it is a good time to do infrastructure projects right now, given the rates of interest. I mean, this is an excellent time to do it. But I want to see projects that have some type of coherent economic or national vision in terms of how they would fit into a national infrastructure, how the provinces would plug into it. I don't want to see projects springing up like toadstools after a summer's rain. Okay, I don't really think that's where we want to go. I think we really have to think through carefully as a country what the east-west infrastructure needs are, whether it's some type of energy transportation infrastructure, whether it's roads, highways, whether we want to focus on environmental infrastructure in terms of, you know, wastewater treatment or plants of that nature. But there has to be something behind it that is more thoughtful than simply it's time to build infrastructure.
This sort of goes to the argument about the shovel-ready versus
Yeah.
shovel-worthy, because one of the you know, in 2008 we had a massive fiscal stimulus budget that was like $50 billion deficit in order to help the economy at a time it was going through a terrible recession. And you know, in that environment, the priority was getting the money out the door as soon as possible because you wanted the economic boost to try and limit how deep the recession was. Right? And so, but a byproduct of that was you ended up with gazebos and skating rinks and, you know, things that were easy to do to the point about, you know, shovel-ready projects. And then but, you know, when we think about infrastructure investments in Ontario, and the Ontario economy isn't contracting at this point in time, right? It's going to be growing at a moderate pace, which means that the priorities really isn't about get the money out the door as fast as humanly possible. It's about making the right investments for Ontario for the long haul. And I think what you're going to see in the budget is a bit of both, the shovel-ready and the shovel-worthy. But I think what you're going to find is more of those shovel-ready projects are going to be in places like Alberta and Newfoundland, where their economies are outright contracting at the moment. And these are economies that actually need support right now. And I think you're going to find that a lot of those shovel-ready projects are things that are going to be at the city level where municipalities have already identified projects that they've been gearing up for or that they're ready to go with. And then on the other hand, you're going to have these, you know, the shovel-worthy ones, which is really about boosting productivity, addressing fundamental challenges that the economies are having. I think in Ontario, it's going to be more about the shovel-worthy ones.
Now,
Okay, just one sec, Mark. We got a couple minutes left. I promised we'd get out of here on time. So I'll let you answer this or respond to the audience's response here. You can comment on what the folks are thinking about expanding public-private partnerships to more non-traditional sectors. Overwhelmingly in support of doing that.
Well, of course. Absolutely. You guys are at the cutting edge of thinking. There's no doubt that, I mean, historically, our public-private partnerships have addressed issues around transportation, so it's been roads and bridges and highways and urban transit. They continue to be important, there's no doubt about that. And also healthcare. So there have been more than 80 hospitals or long-term healthcare facilities built in Canada over the last several years, virtually every hospital in Ontario built using this model. But at some point, you're over-hospitaled, right? So I think you're going to see that, in fact, the next wave of public-private partnerships will start to address some of these critical issues. Water and wastewater, it's probably every municipality's challenge around the country, let alone Ontario, where the infrastructure itself is creaky and leaky, and furthermore doesn't meet current standards. That's going to be a huge area of activity going forward, as is green energy. And the other area, too, that is of particular interest to us in the Council is around something very simple, which is that we want to ensure that every time a shovel goes in the ground to build infrastructure, we make provision right then and there to lay fiber right next to it. So if we're building the Eglinton Crosstown, make provision to lay fiber, and that's going to enable us to up our capacity. So at the moment, we're struggling. We're nowhere near a gigabyte of capacity. And so we've got this unique opportunity to do it every time we build a project, and it's a rounding error in terms of the cost of that project. So let's just make it policy, and it, not only will it be good for us, but it'll help us attract talent from around the world as well, because you want to have innovative communities. So I think that's another area. So that's about broadband, connecting remote communities. Right now, there's a wonderful project taking place in the Northwest Territories. They're laying fiber right up the Mackenzie Valley using a P3 approach. And that's all about connecting communities. And if there's one thing about Canada, we have a heck of a lot of territory, way up north in particular, that isn't connected. So what a wonderful opportunity to use the model in the next iteration to do just that.
All right, well, thanks, Mark. With that, you'll have the last word. And I'd
right.
like to ask Cosmo Manella, a board member from LiUNA, to come up and formally thank our panelists. And while he's on his way, I'd just like to say thanks, Livio, Craig, and Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.